This is the most horrific story I've ever heard about a serial killer. This man killed, cooked, and ate several children in the early 1900s. This is the story of Albert Fish. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870. His family had a history of mental illness, including his mother, who suffered from auditory and visual hallucinations. After Fish's father died, his mother put him in an orphanage where he suffered all kinds of abuse from the boys there. The weird thing about this is Albert started to become noticeably aroused while he was being beaten by the other boys, and that just continued his beatings further. In 1880, his mother got a job and was able to remove him from the orphanage. At age 12, he began a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to some very odd sexual practices, including urolagnia and coprophagia. He also started visiting bathhouses to watch the boys change. He was really adventurous for a 12-year-old. By age 20, he moved to New York City where he became a prostitute and he began raping young boys. Throughout the 1890s, Fish worked as a house painter where he also continued molesting young boys, most of which were younger than the age of 6. Fish recounted one incident where a male lover took him to a waxworks museum and he became very fascinated by this model of a bisection of male genitalia, and this began his interest in genital mutilation. When Fish was about 40 years old in 1910, he met 19-year-old Thomas Kedden. The two of them began a sadomasochistic relationship, and Fish began torturing Thomas Kedden. In Fish's confession, he did imply that Thomas Kedden was intellectually disabled. The torture took place over the course of 2 weeks. It ended when Fish cut off half of Thomas's. Fish poured peroxide on the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, gave him a $10 bill, and then kissed him goodbye. That's what Fish thought the 2 weeks of torture was worth. $10 and a kiss goodbye. That is a whore's goodbye if I've ever heard one. So Albert marries a woman, they have 6 children, she leaves him for the handyman, which leaves him in a horrible mental state. He starts having auditory and visual hallucinations. He also starts indulging in self-harm. Albert started sticking needles into his groin. He also had nails and a paddle that he would beat himself with. Sometimes he would have his children beat him with it. Also, sometimes he would have his children's friends beat him with it whenever they came to visit. He never did anything to his actual children, but this was still extremely disturbing. In 1919, Fish stabbed a boy in Washington, D.C. who was intellectually disabled. He would often attack people who were disabled or African American because he thought that they wouldn't be missed if he had killed them. Albert also claimed to pay other boys to kidnap children for him and bring them to him so that he could torture, mutilate them, and kill them. He did this with what he called his implements of hell, which was a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and also a small handsaw. Pictured here is 10-year-old Grace Budd. In 1928, Fish visited the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretense of hiring Grace's older brother, Edward. He later confessed that he was planning to kill her older brother. When he met the Budd family, he met Edward's younger sister Grace, and then he intended to murder her instead. Albert started buttering up the Budd family parents and started making them feel good, brought them gifts, offered to pay for things, and they were really excited. And then he said that he had to go because he needed to meet his niece for her birthday party and invited Grace to come with him. Grace's mother was apprehensive to this because this was a stranger and she didn't want to send off her daughter with this new stranger, but her father agreed, and so she went with him. Little did they know, Grace would never return. In 1934, just 6 years after Grace disappeared, the Budds received an anonymous letter from Albert Fish detailing all of the things that he did to her. The letter that Albert wrote to the Budds is way too disturbing to share on my TikTok, so feel free to Google it if you'd like. This is a photo of 9-year-old Francis McDonald. On July 14th, 1924, he was out in the Port Richmond neighborhood of Staten Island playing catch with some of his friends, but he never returned home. A search party was organized, and they did find his body hanging from a tree in a nearby wooded area. He had been sexually assaulted and then strangled with his suspenders. According to an autopsy, he suffered several lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring was stripped entirely of its flesh. Francis's mother said she had seen someone coming down the street earlier that day. He had thick, gray hair, he was making strange motions with his hands, and he was whispering to himself. He was also wearing dark gray clothing, which later coined his nickname, the Gray Man. 3 years later, the same thing happened to this boy right here, Billy Gaffney. In 1927, Billy was playing with 2 other boys in an apartment hallway in Brooklyn. The older boy returned back to his apartment, and the younger boys disappeared. They later found one of them on the roof of the apartment, and then Billy Gaffney was actually never discovered. His body has never been found. The only reason that we know Albert Fish did something to Billy Gaffney is because he admitted to it later when he was on trial. And now on to the trial. I know Fish claimed to have murdered at least 100 children in his lifetime, but that couldn't actually be corroborated. There was no evidence to suggest that he had killed that many people. They could only actually ever connect him back to the murders of 3 children. Fish did try to plead insanity, claiming that he heard God's voice telling him to murder all of these children, and there was several psychiatrists who testified about the fact that he had so many sexual abnormalities. One psychiatrist in his summation noted that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon. He had more sexual abnormalities than was ever recorded in a legal or medical document. None of the jurors doubted that Fish was insane, but they wanted to execute him anyway. So they ruled that he was sane and guilty, and he was sentenced to death by electric chair. Fish's lawyer revealed that he was in possession of his client's final statement, several pages that Fish had written in the hours prior to his death. They were never released because his lawyer said it was a string of the most awful obscenities he had ever read. That's it for Albert Fish. Thank you guys so much for watching. Also, happy Pride Month. Like and follow for more.